A wealthy Gulf trillionaire scoffed. Crack this problem and I'll hand you $155 million. No one thought it was possible, but the quiet waitress stepped forward, solved it without breaking a sweat, and left him speechless. If you're loving this story, please hit like and drop a comment below. Your support keeps these amazing stories coming. The 71st floor of the Zayed Capitol Tower pulsed with the kind of tension that only comes with billion-dollar disasters. Rashid Al-Mansouri stood behind his glass desk, dark eyes sweeping across the glittering skyline of Dubai, as if the city below could somehow hand him the answer to the algorithmic crisis that had haunted his company for nearly 4 months. At 36, Rashid had transformed inherited petroleum wealth into a global technology empire spanning 5 continents. His cinch-stitched Brioni suit, worth more than most engineers earned in 2 years, couldn't disguise the fury coiled beneath his polished exterior. The faint shadow of stubble along his jaw hinted at sleepless nights, though he would sooner resign than admit that anything was beyond his control. "Sir, the engineering division is asking about the next strategy session," said his executive assistant, Tarek, hovering at the doorway with a carefully blank expression. Everyone in the building had learned to read the boss's moods like weather forecasts. "Tell them I'm not interested in excuses," said Rashid flatly, his Gulf accent lending a sharp edge to every word. "We've spent $60 million on this problem. Our market value has dropped by 15%, and not one single person on this floor has been able to fix it." The door closed with a soft final click, leaving Rashid alone with his frustration. The advanced neural quantum encryption framework his company needed to secure its next-generation trading platform remained completely unsolved. He had brought in brilliant minds from Oxford and Caltech, top cryptographers from Singapore and Berlin, even 2 former CERN researchers. Every one of them had walked away defeated. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the towers of the financial district blazed with light, completely indifferent to his 9-figure problem. It struck him as a particular kind of irony that a man who could purchase almost anything on Earth could not buy the one solution he actually needed. The distant hum of a floor buffer drifting in from the hallway broke through his thoughts. Rashid glanced at the minimalist clock on the wall. 11:52 p.m. The night cleaning crew was making their rounds, the invisible workforce that kept the Temple of Commerce spotless while the dealmakers slept. A knock at the half-open door. "Come in," he called, assuming it was Tarek with another round of discouraging news. Instead, a young woman entered, rolling a cart stacked with cleaning supplies. She moved with quiet economy, her dark hair swept back in a clean knot, wearing the standard Navy uniform of the contracted maintenance company. But something in the way she carried herself stopped Rashid from turning back to his screen immediately. There was a composed dignity in her bearing that felt entirely out of place on the 71st floor at midnight. "Apologies, Mr. Al-Mansouri." Her voice was clear, unhurried, and carried a polish that surprised him. "Sir, I can return later if now is inconvenient." Rashid studied her for a moment. Most of the cleaning staff kept their eyes on the floor around executives. This woman looked at him directly, with calm, intelligent eyes that contained no trace of unease. "No, go ahead," he said, turning back to the lines of code that mocked him from the screen. "I'll be here until morning anyway." As she began dusting his shelves with measured, methodical strokes, Rashid found himself glancing over more than once. There was something almost philosophical about her movements, as if she had found a kind of peace in bringing order to things. Unlike the frantic energy radiating from his 6-figure employees, this woman moved through the space with a quiet confidence that he found unexpectedly calming. "Late hours suit you?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "The night shift pays better," she replied, still focused on her work. "And it's simpler, fewer variables." Something in how she said it suggested she knew a great deal about complicated variables. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla," she said, moving toward his desk area. Her gaze swept briefly across his monitor, where the unsolvable encryption architecture was displayed in all its layered, maddening complexity. Her hand paused mid-motion above the desk surface. Rashid noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked, dryly. "Don't worry, you can't make it worse. At this point, I'm not sure that's even possible." Layla's eyes had settled on the screen, her brow drawn slightly inward. "This is a quantum neural key architecture," she said softly, almost as if thinking aloud. Rashid's head came up sharply. "I'm sorry?" She seemed to realize she had spoken out loud and quickly looked away. "Nothing, sir. I'll finish up and leave you to it." But Rashid was already on his feet, his full attention locked onto her. "No, say that again. What did you just say about the architecture?" Layla's color rose slightly. I recognized some of the structural mathematics. I studied cryptographic systems a long time ago." "A long time ago," Rashid repeated, his instincts sharpening the way they did before a major negotiation. "Before becoming a cleaner." The question hovered in the air like a challenge. Layla's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Life rarely respects the plans we make, Mr. Al-Mansouri." There was quiet steel in her voice now, and Rashid recognized instantly that he had touched something raw. Good. In his experience, people showed their real character under pressure. "This framework," he said, gesturing at the screen, "has defeated teams of specialist mathematicians for 4 months. It has cost my company tens of millions of dollars. But you're saying you recognize it?" Layla met his eyes steadily. "I said I recognized the structural pattern. I didn't say I could solve it." Rashid felt the familiar electricity that came with sensing a hidden opportunity. This woman was either extraordinarily good at pretending, or she was something else entirely. "Then here's a proposal," he said, his voice taking on the measured, dangerous quality that preceded his most decisive moves. He reached for his phone and navigated to a private banking application. "I have just placed $155 million into a secured escrow account. Solve this framework and every cent is yours. You have 60 minutes. Layla stared at him as if she was reconsidering his sanity entirely. "You can't be serious." "I am always serious about money," Rashid replied, watching her steadily. "You have 1 hour. Solve what the finest mathematical minds in Europe and Asia could not, and leave here wealthier than most governments. Or accept that you've overestimated yourself." The silence between them stretched out and filled the room. Layla's cleaning cart seemed almost absurd in this context, a billionaire placing a 9-figure bet against a woman who scrubbed executive washrooms for minimum wage. "Why would you do this?" Layla asked quietly. Rashid gave a small shrug, though nothing about him was casual right now. "Call it a change of approach. I'm tired of watching expensive specialists fail. Perhaps it's time to find out what someone with nothing to lose is capable of." Layla looked at the screen again, then back at him. Something shifted behind her eyes, a quiet hardening that changed her entire expression. When she rolled her shoulders back, she no longer looked like a cleaner at all. "60 minutes?" she asked. 60 minutes. Layla sat down in his chair with a self-assurance that sent a jolt through Rashid's chest. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for barely a breath before she began typing with a speed and precision that told him immediately and without question that he had either made a catastrophic error in judgment or he was about to witness something extraordinary. Layla's hands moved across the keyboard the way gifted musicians play, intuitive, fluid, completely absorbed. The reserved, cautious woman who had wheeled a supply cart through his door 40 minutes ago had vanished. In her place sat someone who navigated advanced cryptographic architecture the way most people navigate a familiar road home. The real problem isn't the encryption layer itself, she murmured, her voice shifting into something quicker and more precise, as if a different part of her had taken over. It's the temporal synchronization protocol in the verification sequence. Whoever built this foundation was still thinking in linear time while designing for quantum behavior. Rashid's moved around behind her chair, watching as lines of architecture appeared, were modified, and restructured faster than he could follow. The subtle scent of her hair reached him, clean, uncomplicated, and he caught himself distracted by it in a way that he had not been distracted by anything in a very long time. You're reconstructing 4 months of work in real time. I'm not reconstructing it, Layla replied without looking up. I'm replacing the foundation. Your team was building in the wrong direction entirely. The entire logical base was flawed before anyone wrote the first line of code. The confidence in her voice was extraordinary to witness. This was not the hesitant woman from 20 minutes ago. This was someone who spoke advanced mathematics, the way people speak their native language.
"Where did you learn this?" Rashid asked. He found he genuinely wanted to know. Layla's fingers slowed for only a fraction of a second. Imperial College London, Applied Mathematics and Computer Science combined degree, first-class honors. She said it with the same quiet ease she might use to give her address, which somehow made it more astonishing than if she had announced it at a press conference. "Imperial College," Rashid repeated. "And you're here because sometimes exceptionally intelligent people make catastrophically poor decisions about who to trust," Layla said, her voice measured and careful in the way of someone who has had a long time to practice not being angry. There was a story in those words, and Rashid found himself wanting to hear the whole of it. In his experience, the most interesting people were those who had fallen from a great height and learned to walk again. "Someone took from you," he said. "Someone took everything," Layla answered simply. "My company, my patents, my professional standing, my savings. By the time I understood what was happening, he had successfully rewritten the history of everything we'd built together and positioned himself as the genius while making me the supporting character who'd ridden on his coattails." Rashid studied her profile as she worked, the focused clarity of her expression, the way her hands moved across the keyboard with absolute authority. Nothing about this woman suggested she had ever coasted on anything. "Your patents?" Rashid said. 3 of them. Distributed ledger security architectures. They're worth close to $220 million now. Her laugh carried no warmth in it. "It turns out love makes you careless about reading contracts." "Good God," Rashid said under his breath. He had heard of cases like hers, innovators gutted by trusted collaborators, but hearing it in real time from someone who was simultaneously rebuilding his company's most complex technical problem created a kind of vertigo he hadn't anticipated. "Almost there," Layla said. Her voice had returned to her working register, controlled, precise. The neural quantum verification was failing because it assumed stable particle states in an environment where the states are constantly shifting, a fundamental design contradiction. The architecture was fighting itself. Rashid blinked. I understood approximately half of that sentence. Layla glanced back at him for the first time since sitting down, and the corner of her mouth curved upward. "You don't need to understand it. You only need it to work." The smile transformed her completely. For a moment, he could see the person she had been before all of it, the brilliant, confident engineer who had built something worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He could also see, very clearly, that she was beautiful in a way that her uniform and her circumstances had done their best to obscure. "There," she said, leaning back. "Run the full verification sequence." Rashid leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. The code before him had an elegance to it that even his limited technical background could recognize. It was nothing like the dense, struggling attempts his team had produced. He ran the sequence, barely drawing breath. Numbers moved across the screen in patterns that had defeated his experts for 4 straight months. And then, quietly, impossibly, The system produced 2 words that his company had spent $60 million trying to reach. Verification complete. "My God," Rashid whispered. Layla rose from his chair and smoothed her uniform with perfectly steady hands. "The escrow transfer instruction should appear in your system within the next number of minutes. The funds will clear automatically once all verification checks are confirmed." Rashid stared at her. "You actually did it." "I told you I recognized the structural pattern," she said mildly, as though earning $155 million just before midnight on a Tuesday was entirely unremarkable. "Layla," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him fully, "I need to ask you something that may sound completely unreasonable." "Ask?" "Are you actually a cleaner?" She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "I clean offices for 8 hours a night, 5 nights a week. I rent a single-room apartment in Doria that costs me more than half my pay. I have not used my Imperial College degree professionally in 3 years." She paused. "But no, I'm not really a cleaner. I'm someone who became whatever the circumstances required. Tonight, I was a cleaner who happened to solve your problem. Tomorrow, I'll go back to being a cleaner who's rich enough to quit and genuinely doesn't know yet what she wants to do instead." The vulnerability in that last sentence caught him completely off guard. Here was a woman who had just demonstrated a level of intellectual capability that would make her invaluable to any technology company on the planet, and she sounded quietly, simply lost.
"You could come and work with me," Rashid said, surprising himself. Layla looked at him and laughed, genuinely, briefly. "Mr. Al-Mansuri, you just handed me enough money that I never have to work for anyone. Why would I choose to work for someone who resolves technical crises by making 9-figure bets against members of the cleaning staff?" "Because," Rashid said, moving a step closer, "I think you are exactly the kind of person who needs to build things, and I am exactly the kind of person who makes building things possible." For a moment, something passed between them, a current of recognition that had nothing to do with algorithms or escrow accounts. Layla's eyes widened slightly, as though she was seeing him properly for the first time. Then she stepped back and broke the moment with the same quiet efficiency with which she'd done everything else that night. "I should finish the rest of the floor. Congratulations on your framework, Mr. Al-Mansuri." She moved toward her cart, but Rashid caught her arm gently. "Layla, have dinner with me tomorrow night." She looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. "You're asking your cleaner on a dinner date?" "I'm asking the most brilliant person I've met in a decade to have dinner with me. The fact that I met her while she was restocking my soap dispenser is simply interesting context." Layla looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Al-Mansuri, we both know this is a terrible idea." "Almost certainly," Rashid agreed. "But I haven't been this genuinely curious about another person in years. And after tonight, I suspect you may be worth quite a few terrible ideas." 24 hours later, Rashid found himself in a situation he could not remember experiencing before. He was nervous. The rooftop restaurant he had reserved for their dinner suddenly struck him as excessive, one of those displays of scale and wealth that probably reminded Layla of the world that had been used against her. He changed the booking twice, eventually settling on a small, warmly lit Italian place in the old city that he had visited exactly once before, but remembered as being genuinely good without announcing itself. Layla arrived exactly on time, in a simple dark dress that managed to look both understated and elegant. Something had changed in the way she held herself compared to the previous night. She was still contained, but the professional armor was lighter. When she sat across from him, Rashid felt the quiet thrill of knowing this was not going to be a predictable evening. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about how she and her former partner, a man named Marcus Webb, had built their cryptographic startup in London from nothing, working 16-hour days in a rented office above a laundromat, surviving on instant noodles in the conviction that they were building something that mattered. She had been the architect. Marcus had been the face. She had been comfortable with that arrangement. She had trusted him completely. The betrayal had been slow and carefully constructed. Marcus had begun building a parallel narrative with their investors, one in which Layla's ideas were collaborative outputs, their shared work, produced by the team he led. He was strategic about it, never making direct claims that could be challenged, just consistently repositioning credit until the framework was established. By the time Layla realized what had been happening, the board was already convinced of a version of events that made her look like a difficult, possessive co-founder who struggled to share credit. She lost her stake, she lost the patents, she lost 3 years of her professional life. Every position she applied for in London produced the same result. Someone had been there first with the same careful story. She moved to Dubai for a fresh start. The fresh start had not quite arrived yet. Rashid listened without interrupting. He felt something he recognized from his more serious negotiations, the sensation of understanding the actual shape of a problem for the first time. "You should have fought." "With what?" Layla answered simply. "Marcus had made sure that any legal action I took would look exactly the kind of unstable, litigious behavior he'd been describing to people for months. No firm in London would take the case. I couldn't afford the retainer. Sometimes the position you're in has already been decided for you by someone else." Rashid studied her face, looking for self-pity or resentment. He found neither. What he found was something harder earned than either of those, a clear-eyed acceptance that had cost her significantly to reach. "You rebuilt." "I tried. Reputations are stubborn things in technical industries, so I became invisible instead. As a cleaner, no one asks about your past, no one wants your ideas, no one expects anything from you beyond the task in front of you. You exist in the margins of other people's days. It's very quiet." The sadness in how she described it was almost unbearable. Rashid found himself thinking about Marcus Webb with a cold, focused anger that was entirely out of proportion to a story about a stranger. But it did not feel like a story about a stranger. "You were not invisible," he said. "Not to me." Layla looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, Rashid." Rashid? His name and her voice sounded different, warmer somehow, more real. "I appreciate what you're saying, but have dinner with me tomorrow night." Layla blinked. "We're having dinner right now." "Different dinner. Same conversation, but deeper. I want to understand how your mind approaches things. I want to know what it takes to rebuild an entire life from nothing." He leaned forward slightly. "And honestly, I want to spend more time with the most interesting person I have spoken to in years. You barely know me." "Then let me fix that." Layla looked at him the way he imagined she looked at a complex problem, working through it carefully, testing each element. Finally, she said, "This is complicated, Rashid. We exist in different worlds. 3 days ago, perhaps, but yesterday you made yourself $155 million richer. Which world belongs to you now?" Layla considered this. "Honestly, I don't know yet." "Then let's find out together." Something in her expression softened, a slight release in the careful composure she maintained. "Want more dinner?" she said quietly. "Good," Rashid said, and his smile was unhurried and genuine. "I have a feeling we're only just beginning." Then, as if perfectly timed, Layla's phone lit up on the table. She glanced at it and went very still. "What is it?" Rashid asked. "Marcus," she said quietly. "He wants to meet." The cafe Marcus had chosen was deliberately unremarkable, a mid-range chain in the financial district that conveyed neither wealth nor pressure, just carefully calibrated neutrality. Layla sat across from the man who had been her entire world for 4 years, studying a face that she had once believed she knew completely. She searched it for the person she had thought she loved and found only the architecture of someone she no longer recognized. Marcus Webb looked precisely as she remembered. Clean, confident, wearing the kind of understated, expensive clothing that communicated seriousness without effort. He smiled at her the way he always had, warmly, attentively, and her skin crawled. "You're looking well, Layla," he said, in that familiar voice that had once been the last sound she heard before falling asleep. "What do you want, Marcus?" She had no interest in small talk.
His eyebrows rose with practiced mild surprise. Straight to it. I always respected that about you. You have 30 minutes. Marcus leaned back and studied her with the calm, calculating expression she had learned to read far too late. I heard about your recent development, $155 million for solving an encryption problem. That's impressive work. The words hit her like cold water. How did you hear about that? Layla, you solved a problem that had been stalling one of the largest investment firms in the Gulf region for months. Word moves quickly in these circles. These circles, she repeated flatly. I clean office buildings, Marcus. We don't share circles anymore. Don't we? His smile developed an edge. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks as though you found yourself a very influential patron. Rashid Al-Mansouri is quite the figure. Layla's blood cooled. Have you been watching me? I keep an eye on former professional partners, standard practice. You can imagine my interest when I discovered my former colleague was working as a cleaner in a building connected to one of my potential strategic investors. Potential investors. Al-Mansouri Capital has been in discussions with my current company about a possible technology partnership. Remarkable coincidence. Layla stared at him, the implications symboling themselves in her mind with horrible clarity. You engineered this. Engineered what? He shook his head with an expression of gentle concern. Your employment situation? Your work on his algorithm? Your dinner last night? Ah, sighed he softly. Layla, you always did have a tendency to see patterns where there weren't any. For a moment, the old doubt crept in, the familiar, insidious voice that asked if maybe she was the problem after all. Then she remembered the look on Rashid's face when his verification sequence completed. Pure, unguarded astonishment. Marcus couldn't have staged that. "What do you want?" she asked for the second time. Marcus slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was a contract, dense legal language that Layla parsed quickly with the practiced speed of someone who spent years working in intellectual property. "That's my signature," she said barely over a whisper. "From our original partnership agreement, Clause 12, subsection D. All innovations relating to cryptographic architecture or quantum computing applications developed during our professional relationship remain subject to joint intellectual property rights for a period of 6 years following formal dissolution." The room seemed to tilt. "You never agreed to any such thing." "Your signature says otherwise." His voice remained pleasant and even. Of course, at the time, quantum applications seemed entirely theoretical. We were focused on distributed ledger systems. But the mathematics you applied to Al-Mansouri's problem, the temporal synchronization approach, that framework was developed during our time together. "You added this after I signed." "Prove it," he said, and the simplicity of it was like a door closing. Layla's hands trembled against the table surface. She pressed them flat. "Even if this were valid, which it is not, I developed that solution independently. The work I did last night was entirely my own." "Was it?" Marcus tilted his head. "I have documentation suggesting the foundational mathematics you used were part of theoretical research we conducted jointly during our second year working together, the temporal variance modeling that made your breakthrough possible. You know I'm right about that."
And she did. That was the awful part. The base mathematical framework she had drawn on, she had first developed those ideas during late nights in their shared office in Bermondsey, testing theoretical approaches that seemed purely academic at the time. You can't prove I used that framework.
I don't need to prove it, Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. I only need to raise the question. Think about what happens when Al-Mansuri Capital learns that their newly discovered mathematical genius may be legally obligated to share her innovations with a competing firm. Think about how that affects their interest in working with you. Layla felt sick. You're going to blackmail me? I'm going to recover what's fair, Marcus said, and for just a moment the smoothness slipped and something colder showed underneath. You cost me 18 months of reconstruction time, Layla. 18 months of rebuilding work that was rightfully mine. This is simply a correction. Those innovations were mine. Prove it. The repetition felt like a physical strike. I want 50% of your recent payment, $77.5 million, as recognition of the foundational work that made your solution possible. If you choose not to cooperate, I file an injunction blocking you from utilizing any algorithm incorporating jointly developed intellectual property. I contact the financial press with the story of the legal dispute surrounding Al-Mansuri's encryption solution, and I make certain that every significant employer in the industry understands that hiring Layla Sharma carries meaningful legal risk. Layla sat very still. Even if she could eventually defeat him in court, and she might, the process alone would obliterate any professional future she was beginning to imagine. It would certainly destroy whatever was growing between her and Rashid before it had any chance to become something real. You absolute coward, she said quietly. I'm a pragmatist, and unlike the last time, I'm not letting sentiment get in the way of what makes sense. He stood and laid exact change for his coffee on the table with the methodical care of someone who calculated everything. 48 hours, Layla. After that, I file, and, he paused near her shoulder, his voice dropping to something that was meant to sound caring. You may want to think carefully about what you tell Al-Mansuri about this conversation. Men in his position don't welcome complications, especially ones that come attached to women with legal histories. He walked out. Layla sat alone with the contract and with the understanding that even her most complete escape had not been complete enough. Her phone lit up. Rashid's name. Free for dinner tonight? Don't want to wait until tomorrow. Layla stared at the screen. She typed 3 different responses, deleted all of them. Finally turned the phone face down on the table and walked out of the cafe, leaving the contract behind like the contaminated thing it was. She had 48 hours. Either she told Rashid and watched him decide she was not worth the complication, or she stayed silent and let Marcus take half of everything she had just earned, along with whatever was left of her self-respect. Either way, Marcus won. Rashid checked his phone for the 6th time in an hour. Layla's brief, distant message, "Something's come up, we'll reschedule," felt nothing like the woman who had sat across from him the previous evening. Something was wrong. The instinct was clear and certain. He was still weighing whether to respect her distance or go to her when Tariq knocked. "Sir, there's a Marcus Webb here. He says he represents a technology group interested in discussing a strategic investment opportunity." Webb. Rashid felt something shift in him like a weight settling into place. Different surname from Layla's, but the timing was not a coincidence. "Show him in." The man who entered was everything Layla had described. Presentable, controlled, radiating a practiced warmth that Rashid recognized immediately as a professional instrument. Every element of Marcus Webb's presentation, the firm handshake, the self-deprecating opening, the way he occupied space in a room, was calibrated. Mr. Al-Mansouri, Marcus Webb, Managing Director of Webb Cryptographic Systems, I appreciate you making time. Rashid shook his hand. I understand you have a business matter. I do, but I feel I should establish some context first. Layla Sharma and I have a shared professional and personal history. I thought transparency was appropriate. The statement was constructed to unsettle. Rashid allowed nothing to show. Ms. Sharma is a recent professional acquaintance, he said evenly. What is it you're proposing? Marcus placed a tablet on Rashid's desk, displaying legal contracts, technical development logs, and a partnership dissolution agreement bearing Layla's signature. Rashid scanned the documents with the practiced speed of someone who had reviewed thousands of contracts. On the surface, they appeared well-constructed, notarized, professionally formatted, technically coherent. But something was wrong with them. He could feel it the way he felt when the numbers in an acquisition proposal were technically correct but structurally dishonest. You're claiming partial ownership of the algorithm Layla solved for my firm. I'm claiming recognition of the foundational mathematical framework that made her solution possible, work developed jointly during our professional partnership and subject to our original intellectual property agreement. And you're bringing this to me because I imagine you would prefer to be aware of any potential legal complications before they become public. An intellectual property dispute involving your recent encryption breakthrough would not be ideal press coverage. Rashid leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus Webb with the particular quality of attention he reserved for people who were trying to pick his pocket while shaking his hand. Mr. Webb, he said finally, my firm employs some of the finest intellectual property counsel in the region. If there are legitimate questions about the provenance of this algorithm, we will address them through the appropriate legal channels. I'd also note that anyone seeking to leverage legal ambiguity as the basis for informal financial arrangements would be taking a significant personal risk in doing so. Something moved briefly behind Marcus's composed expression, a flicker of recalculation.
Of course, Marcus said smoothly. I simply felt it was right to be transparent about the situation. After Marcus left, Rashid sat alone in his office for a full 2 minutes. The documents were plausible, but Layla's work the previous night had been instantaneous, organic, and completely fluent. The work of someone operating in territory that was entirely and naturally their own. His mathematical architecture she'd built could not have been assembled from memory of someone else's research. He had watched her hands as she worked. There had been no hesitation, no retrieval, only creation. His phone buzzed. Tariq again. Sir, I have a Dr. Priya Nair on hold. She says she's calling from Imperial College London and that it concerns Layla Sharma. She says it's important. Rashid took the call immediately. Dr. Nair. Mr. Al-Mansouri, I apologize for calling without warning. Layla Sharma was one of the most exceptional students I supervised in 20 years of teaching. I understand she recently solved a significant problem for your firm. She did. And I understand her former partner Marcus Webb has contacted you about intellectual property concerns. Rashid's pulse steadied into something sharper. How did you know that? Because Marcus Webb has been doing the same thing to every professional contact Layla has made for the past 3 years. He uses identical documentation, identical language, identical pressure. His purpose is not legal, it's isolation. He needs Layla to remain professionally invisible. The contracts are fabricated? The base contracts are real, but they're presented without the subsequent documentation that legally dissolves his claims entirely, documentation establishing Layla's independent development of the relevant mathematical frameworks after the partnership ended.
She rebuilt those theoretical models from scratch after she left him. I supervised that work personally. Dr. Nayer's voice carried the weight of someone who had watched an injustice unfold in slow motion for years. Mr. Al-Mansouri, Marcus Webb is a technically capable programmer, but what Layla does is in a different category. What she built for you last night is entirely, provably, legally her own work. Why hasn't she been able to fight this? Because Marcus has made the cost of fighting him appear insurmountable at every turn, and because 3 years of sustained professional sabotage eventually works on a person's sense of what they deserve. A pause. I have been waiting 3 years for someone with the resources to finally call his bluff. Would you be prepared to provide formal testimony? I've had the documentation ready for 2 years, Dr. Nayer said. I was only waiting for someone to ask. Rashid ended the call and immediately contacted his head of legal affairs. By the time the sun touched the skyline, he had a complete legal strategy, not only to defeat Marcus Webb's fraudulent claims, but to document the full pattern of professional interference that had been used against Layla across multiple instances over 3 years. He drove to her building in Daira as the evening was cooling. He opened the door looking like someone who had been awake for a long time, dressed in old clothes that seemed to take up as little space as possible. "Rashid," she said quietly, "you shouldn't be here. Marcus came to my office today." Her face went still. "What did he tell you?" "A very well-constructed story about shared intellectual property and legal risk," Rashid said. "It would have been entirely convincing, except that I also received a call from Dr. Priya Nair at Imperial College." Layla stared at him. "Priya called you?" "She called to explain exactly what Marcus has been doing for the past 3 years, and to provide testimony confirming your algorithm is entirely your own." He moved slightly forward. "Layla, you have been legally in the right the entire time. The documents Marcus presents are real, but deliberately incomplete. The subsequent agreements that establish your independent ownership of the relevant mathematical frameworks exist. He simply never shows them to anyone." Layla's legs seemed to give way beneath her slightly. She sat down on the small sofa behind her. "That's not possible." "Not only is it possible, it's on paper. My legal team spent this afternoon reviewing your original partnership dissolution documents. Marcus Webb has no legitimate claim to anything you've created. He has been committing fraud, and he has been doing it because each time he threatens someone, the cost of fighting him was higher than the cost of surrender." Layla was very quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely there. 3 years. I have spent 3 years believing I had somehow brought this on myself." "You brought nothing on yourself," Rashid said. He sat beside her, wanting to reach for her hand, but sensing that she needed to find her footing first. "None of it. You were targeted by someone who understood precisely how to use your trust against you." "What happens now?" "Now, we end it," Rashid said simply. "My legal team is filing charges for fraud, deliberate defamation, and sustained interference with professional relationships. By the end of the week, Marcus Webb's career will be finished." Layla looked at him. Something was breaking open in her expression. Not apart, but free. "And us?" she asked quietly.
Rashid reached for her hand. "That is entirely your decision, but Layla, what I feel toward you has nothing to do with algorithms or money or any of this. It has to do with the fact that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time." "I've been afraid to hope for anything," Layla said. "For 3 years, I haven't let myself want anything better." "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Rashid said quietly. "I'm not leaving." When Layla kissed him, it felt like the first honest breath she had taken in years. 6 months later, Layla stood at the window of what had been Marcus Webb's former company headquarters,
watching the last of his staff carry out their belongings. The regulatory investigation was thorough and swift. Once the full pattern of his conduct was formally documented, 11 other individuals came forward with nearly identical stories. "It still doesn't feel entirely real," Dr. Nair said, who had traveled to Dubai specifically for this occasion. She stood beside Layla, looking out over the financial district. "I still half expect to wake up," Layla admitted. "Good dreams have been rationed for quite a while." Dr. Nair smiled. "And Rashid?" "Complicated," Layla said, with the small warmth she couldn't quite suppress. "He offered you chief technology officer at his firm, with a compensation package that would embarrass most corporate boards. That doesn't sound complicated." "I turned it down." Dr. Nair's eyebrows rose. "Should I ask why?" "Because I need to know I can build something on my own before I share a life with someone else. I spent 3 years convinced I was broken. I can't go from that into measuring my worth against Rashid's success. I need to know what I'm worth when there's no one beside me to reference myself against." "What did Rashid say when you told him that?" Layla smiled properly for the first time in the conversation. "He said it was the most beautifully stubborn thing he'd ever heard, and that he'd be here when I was ready." "He sounds like someone worth keeping." "He is. He also, as an investor with very clear professional boundaries, helped me secure the founding capital for my own company." Dr. Nair looked at her carefully. "How is that going?" 4 patents pending, 3 major contracts signed, a development team of 14 people, most of whom have their own version of a Marcus Webb story. Layla's voice carried something that had been absent from it for a very long time, a quiet, earned confidence. "We're calling it Meridian Technologies." "Perfect." Before Dr. Nair could say anything further, Layla's phone buzzed, a message from Rashid. "Dinner tonight? I have something to tell you." She wrote back, "Good news or difficult news?" His response came quickly. "Depends on how you feel about marriage proposals." Layla stared at the screen. Her heart stopped completely for several seconds. Dr. Nair, reading along despite herself, laughed. "Well," she said, "that answers your question about whether he intends to wait." Layla's hands were unsteady as she typed. "That is not funny." "Rashid, who said I was joking? Dinner at 8. Layla stepped away from Dr. Nair and called him directly. He answered before the second ring. "Please tell me you're not actually proposing over text message." "I was going to wait until dinner, but I find I'm quite unexpectedly nervous about waiting that long." She could hear his smile in his voice, warm, genuine, slightly undone. "Layla, you were the most brilliant, most frustratingly determined, most completely extraordinary person I have ever known. You rebuilt your entire life from the foundations. You built a company from nothing, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, you managed to fall, very inconveniently, I might add, for a workaholic Gulf trillionaire who had no idea what happiness actually felt like until the evening you sat down at his desk." Layla felt the tears beginning. "You make me want to be better than I actually am," Rashid continued. "You challenge everything I thought I understood about the world. You solve problems before most people have finished identifying them. I love your stubbornness. I love your precision. I love that you look at me like I might be worth something beyond what appears in my financial portfolio." "Rashid," she whispered, "I'm not asking you to give up Meridian or your independence or your magnificent habit of arguing about every significant decision. I'm asking you to build something with me that's larger than either of us could build alone." Layla was crying now, standing in the emptied office of the man who had taken 3 years from her, feeling those 3 years become simply the route that had led her here. "You cannot propose over the phone," she managed. "I can do whatever I want. I'm a trillionaire. His tone was light, but she could hear the nerves beneath it. "You still haven't answered. Ask me again at dinner." "Is that a yes?" "That's a bring a ring and find out." His laughter was warm and flooded with relief. 8 hours later, Layla sat across from Rashid at the small Italian restaurant in the old city where they had first talked properly. He had reserved the same table. The familiarity of it felt like a door closing gently on everything that had come before. "Nervous?" she asked, noting how often he checked the time. "Genuinely terrified," he admitted. "I have finalized 9-figure deals with considerably less anxiety than this." "Good," she said. "I'd hate to think I was straightforward." "The last word I would use to describe you," Rashid said, reaching across the table for her hand. "Are you ready?" "Actually," Layla said, "I have something to say first." His expression shifted with concern. "That sounds serious." 7 months ago, I was cleaning your office, and I had genuinely come to believe I was invisible. You saw something in me that I had stopped being able to see in myself. You didn't just give me money or professional opportunity. You gave me back the part of myself that believed anything was still possible." "Layla, I'm not finished." She held his hand firmly. "You could have used my situation to make me dependent on you. Instead, you pushed me back toward my own independence. You could have let gratitude become the foundation of something between us. Instead, you made it about choice." She stood up from her chair and moved around the table. She reached into her bag. "So before you proposed to me," she dropped to one knee beside his chair, holding a small box, "I'm proposing to you." Rashid's face went completely still, then completely open. Layla opened the box, revealing a slim, clean platinum band. "Rashid Mansouri," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "You are infuriating and generous and brilliant and absolutely incapable of accepting the word no. You helped me remember who I was before Marcus, and you helped me become someone better." She took a breath. "You challenge me, you support me, you make me laugh, and you have never once made me feel like I needed to diminish myself to leave room for your confidence. I love your ridiculous grand gestures. I love the way you look at me like I've done something extraordinary just for being in the room. And I love that when I told you I needed to build something on my own first, you said yes without hesitation." "Layla," he breathed. "I'm asking you to build a life with me," she continued, "not as my patron or my investor or my safety net, but as my equal, as my closest friend, as the person I choose every day for the rest of my life." She lifted the ring. "Rashid al-Mansouri, will you marry me?" For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then he began to laugh. Deep, unstoppable, joyful laughter that turned heads across the restaurant and filled Layla's chest with something she had not felt in years. "Yes," he said, pulling her to her feet and into him. "Yes, completely, without question, yes." When they kissed, the last carefully maintained wall came down. When they finally separated, Rashid was still grinning. "I should mention that I also brought a ring." "Show me." He produced a small box from inside his jacket, opening it to reveal a stone that managed to be simultaneously breathtaking and perfectly restrained. "Layla Sharma, will you marry me back?" "It depends," she said, smiling. "Are you prepared for a lifetime of me being right about encryption architectures?" "I am prepared for a lifetime of you being right about everything, as long as you're prepared for a lifetime of me pretending to disagree about it." "Deal." And she kissed him again. Later, walking together through the lit streets of the old city, Layla thought about the particular paths that lives take. A year ago, she had been invisible, genuinely, deliberately invisible, certain that her story had already reached its ending. Now she was engaged to a man who saw her precisely as she was. She was running a company built entirely on her own terms. She was surrounded by people who valued what she thought and who she was. "Any regrets?" Rashid asked, as though he'd been reading her thoughts. Layla considered the question with the care it deserved. "Not one," she said. "About any of it. About Marcus, or the 3 years, or the night shift, or the cleaning cart, or any of the path that brought me to that office on the night I met you." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Every hard thing that happened led me here, and this, us, is worth all of it." "Even the part where I was an arrogant man who challenged a member of the cleaning staff to solve an impossible algorithm at midnight?" "Especially that part. So, for the record, I was never really just a cleaner." "No," Rashid said. "You were a remarkable person waiting for the right moment to remind the world of exactly who she was." Layla stood on her toes to kiss him once more. "Thank you for being my moment, Rashid Al-Mansouri." "Thank you for being mine, Layla Sharma." As they walked home, making plans for a future that neither of them could have imagined 7 months before, Layla understood that the best stories sometimes begin with the end of everything you thought you wanted. That sometimes you have to lose yourself entirely to find who you were truly meant to be. And that sometimes, if you are fortunate enough, you find someone who can see your worth clearly, even when you have forgotten it yourself. Someone who does not rescue you, but stands quietly beside you while you recover the strength to rescue yourself. Layla held Rashid's hand and walked forward into the city lights, ready for whatever came next.